Welcome back to the Grateful Grief podcast. This is your host, Sarah Armstrong. I'm so glad you joined us for this second episode. Today we're going to explore a very personal, significant topic. Our first experience with grief. The early encounters you have with loss shape the way we understand and process grief throughout our lives. Let's start with a question for you. Have you ever thought about your first experience with grief? Think about how old you were. How did you process it? How did everyone around you deal with the grief? Did they talk about it or just ignore it? Did you have a safe space or environment to grieve or ask questions about your feelings? Reflecting on these questions can help us understand our own grief journey. I'd like to share my personal story with you. When I allowed myself to think about my first introduction to grief, it was the loss of my grandmother, Mamie. I was a child at the time, and nobody really talked about her death or what they were feeling. There was no dialogue. I recall traveling to Alabama on the train with my mother, but there was no real discussion about where we were going and why we were going. I just knew that Grandma Mamie was dead. My mother was a very stoic person and never was visibly upset, at least in front of me. In our household, we never talked about it or gave it a name. It was as if grief was a taboo subject, something to be dealt with in silence. As a child, I didn't have the words or the understanding to process what had happened. I was left to navigate my feelings all alone without a safe space to grieve or ask questions. We went to the funeral home and I saw my grandmother in the casket and she looked like she was asleep. I had so many questions, but was told to go sit down and be quiet. I remember my mother and her siblings arguing with each other about who would take care of my grandfather, who would live in the family home, who would get the china and the silverware. There was very little crying or discussion about my grandmother or the type of person she had been or the life she had lived. Experiences like this as a child can profoundly shape our future grief experiences. When grief isn't acknowledged or discussed, it can create a sense of isolation and confusion. It can make us feel like we have to hide our emotions or deal with them on our own. Or if we show it an emotion, there's something wrong with that. As we grow older, those early experiences influence how we cope with subsequent losses. We struggle to know how to express our feelings or to reach out for support. On the other hand, understanding these early encounters grief can be a powerful tool for healing. By recognizing how our past has shaped us, we can begin to change the way we approach grief and support others in their journeys. I encourage you, take some time to reflect on your own first experience with grief. Consider sharing your story with someone you trust. Send it in as a comment to this podcast or write it down. Understanding our past can help us navigate the present and the future with more compassion and resilience. Thank you for joining me today and allowing me to share my story. In our next episode, we'll continue this conversation and delve deeper into how these experiences influence our adult lives. Remember, you're not alone on this journey. Together we can find strength and hope and gratitude amidst the grief. Until next time, take care and be kind to yourself. This is Sarah Armstrong signing off, and thank you for being a part of the Grateful Grief Podcast.